Fryderyk Chopin is linked with the national soul and psyche of Poland. If you try to tell the story of Chopin, it is impossible to ignore the history of his country. Chopin was both Polish and cosmopolitan. His music is a tremendous source of pride for his country, but at the same time, it is beloved in the whole world and speaks to everyone. Walking in the footsteps of Chopin on Krakow Avenue in Warsaw, one is struck by the beauty of the streets, the splendid buildings, and a city that is looking into the future but does not turn its back on its history. As a pianist, it touches your heart when a classical composer is a hero of a country more than any sports star will ever be. Maybe I am just a nostalgic fool, lost in a society where classical music, compared to only 25 years ago, is in the shadows of commercial entertainment. But thinking of the thousands of young pianists who are, in this moment, playing a piece by Chopin on their piano, or the millions of people who listen to his music, makes me believe that a detailed documentary about the life and music of him will be welcomed. This is my tribute to Chopin, to everyone all over the world who loves his music, and to the beautiful city of Warsaw. For over 200 years, until 1795, which was only 15 years before Chopin was born, Poland was a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was large and powerful, at its heights reaching eastward to include almost the entire land of what is today Belarus and Ukraine. On May 3rd, in 1791, Poland adopted Europe's first modern constitution, based on the Constitution of the United States, with checks and balances and separation of powers. The Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, was furious. She saw Poland as a satellite state in her empire and believed the new constitution threatened Russian influence in Poland. The Commonwealth had been in a steady decline, and in 1792, Russia declared war.
By the end of 18th century, the situation of Poland was very difficult because the country was losing big parts of it by three invaders, by Russia, Prussia and Austria. What happened in 1795 when the last partition took place? Poland stopped existed on the map. Only with Napoleon it could renew, so to speak, and there were big hopes.
Nicolas Chopin was born in 1771 in the little village of Marinville in France. At the age of 16, he decided to leave France and travel to Poland. There, he started to work in a tobacco factory in Warsaw, but would eventually become a tutor in French. A British traveler described Warsaw in the very beginning of the 1800s.
The whole town has a melancholy appearance, exhibiting that strong contrast between wealth and poverty, luxury and distress, which pervades every part of this unhappy country. The streets are spacious, but ill-paved, the churches and public buildings are large and magnificent, the palaces of the nobility numerous and splendid, but the greater part of the houses are ill-constructed, wooden hovels.
In 1802, Nicolas, who by now had changed his name to the Polish Mikołaj, started to teach the children of an aristocratic family in a place where he would meet his future wife, Justyna Krzyżanowska, who some years later would give birth to Poland's greatest son.
Chopin was born in Żelazowa Wola manor. It is not far from Warsaw. His mother was employed there, Whereas his father, who was French in origin, was probably teaching French already. They started as a simple employees at the manor of one of the Polish aristocratic families, whose name was Skarbek. We have to do with two different personalities which are united by these differences. As far as Chopin's father is concerned, he was a man of 18th century. He was a man of enlightenment, with all his reasonable things, reasonable decisions, reasonable approach to life. And we see this personality through the exchange of letters between Frederic and his family, and of course with his father. The father was always warning Chopin to be reasonable in financial activity, etc., etc. And he was always warning Chopin, be careful. On the other hand, the mother of Chopin was a typical representative of Polish gentry, but not this aristocratic gentry, very rich. This middle, so to speak, middle gentry, and influenced Chopin's personality in a deeper sense, not in this reasonable sense of the father, but in a deeper sense. We don't know whether the mother of Chopin was somehow musically educated. We don't know about it. Possibly could probably play piano. We only know that the father played flute and was musically educated somehow and was open to music. So the question arises of the musical environment of young Frederic. I think that the music was present in this family, of course in the limited way typical for popular musical culture, but there was this atmosphere which was starting point for the further development, for the individual development of Frederic.
In 1806, Napoleon's forces won in the so-called War of the Fourth Coalition. In the treaty following the war, Warsaw and a part of Poland around Warsaw was handed over to Napoleon, and the Duchy of Warsaw was created, which was still in place when Chopin was born in 1810.
It's a very nice idea, I think. I was wondering about that.
When Chopin was only 7 months old, the family moved to Warsaw. Krakow Avenue in central Warsaw, with its bustling energy, was the street where Chopin walked, played, and in the winter even skated as a child and a young man. Nicholas started working at the Warsaw Lyceum, and he and Justina moved into a spacious apartment in one of the buildings of the school with their son Fryderyk and his 3 sisters.
He had 3 sisters, Ludwika, Isabella, and Emilia. They were talented as far as literary activity is concerned. Well, Ludwika published even some prosa, some works of her. We don't know so much about Isabella, but Emilia was probably even more talented than Ludwika. She unfortunately died at the age 15, and this was to greater sorrow of the family, of Chopin himself. It was probably his first big trauma he encountered in his life, the trauma connected with the death of Emilia. It seems that Ludwika had a special relation with Chopin. They were particularly close spiritually. She understood him very well, and he knew it. So one knows that one is understood not only in everyday things, but also in spiritual way. Actually, Ludwika was present at Chopin's deathbed. She accompanied him until his last moment. The relation between Napoleon and Poland starts with the hopes of Polish people, the hopes that Napoleon would recreate free Poland. And in fact, it was a relatively small part. So even up today, in Polish consciousness, Napoleon is considered as a hero, as a friend of Poland.
In 1812, the Russian Tsar Alexander I issued an ultimatum demanding the evacuation of French troops from the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon's answer was to set his sights on defeating Imperial Russia. But this was a war that ended in disaster for the French troops, and it would be the start of the demise of Napoleon's power.
When Napoleon lost his power, there was afterwards Congress of Vienna, and at this Congress was decided the status of Poland. It was Kingdom of Poland, but the problem was that the king was the Tsar. And that's the historical environment in which Chopin's family grew up. But one has to admit that the way this Kingdom of Poland existed was relatively liberal, relatively. There was Polish parliament, there were Polish ministers, there was also Polish army. So the situation of this Kingdom of Poland was relatively free, and the culture was developing there. So young Chopin, young Frederic, could witness a very interesting cultural situation, which means, for instance, the presence of musicians, the presence of operas. So the cultural environment of Frederic was very, very positive for him during his Warsaw time.
Chopin's father was a devoted teacher, and in 1814 he got promoted to the rank of full professor in French and literature at the Lyceum. He also offered a boarding school in the building he lived in, taking on boys to prepare them for the Lyceum. He charged a substantial fee, but thanks to his reputation, the boarding school thrived. One of the neighbors of the Chopin family wrote that Mikołaj taught his children and boarders to be polite, civilized, and to develop good working habits. The sensible approach of Chopin's father was that if you are not a good human being, your talent is not worth much. At the age of 4, Chopin started to play the piano, most probably being taught by Ludwika, who was musical and who played the piano. Frederic soon outpaced his sister at the piano, and the parents had a feeling that Frederic's talent was something special.
Chopin, as a child, had access to piano. We don't know how and why and where. Probably in his family, because at this time piano was a part of families of the then middle class. So when he had an access to piano, and when the parents realized that he has an extraordinary talent, they started to look for a teacher for him. And they found a teacher whose name was Wojciech Żywny. He was a Czech, an old teacher, educated on Bach, and he was practically the only one teacher of Chopin, the only one piano teacher. He probably was the first to discover the genius of Chopin, and he helped to publish his first music. This was Polonaise in G minor. this education didn't last long. At some point, it was not enough for Chopin to stay with this teacher, and he simply started to develop himself. That's a Chopin phenomenon, that he didn't have a long, serious piano education, didn't have different teachers. How many 19th century composers have many teachers? Chopin had just one, and then he started to develop himself in an extraordinary way, extraordinary original way. So he was a kind of wunderkind, and the difference between him and Mozart is that he was not exploited by his father. That makes a big difference. The father, who was the man of enlightenment, very well knew how his child could develop, and he was very careful. He didn't look for other teachers because he realized that that's enough. He will develop himself. He will create his music himself as he wished. And the only step was to send Chopin to the lessons of composition. But this is another matter, of course.
Chopin's first performance took place when he was 8 years old in what now stands as the Presidential Palace in Warsaw. Soon he became a favorite among the rich and influential, and the boy became known as the Polish Mozart.
You know, when one family discovered a kind of wunderkind, they said to another family, and another family asked another. So this is how Chopin became very well known.
After a concert in 1823, Chopin being not yet 13 years old, a Warsaw newspaper wrote, "Vienna reports that an equally young pianist by the name of Liszt astonished everyone there. After this evening, we shall certainly not envy Vienna their Mr. Liszt, as our capital possesses an equal to him, perhaps even superior, in the person of young Mr. Chopin." Duke Konstantin Pavlovich Romanov was the brother of Tsar Alexander I. The Tsar installed Konstantin as governor and de facto ruler of the Kingdom of Poland. He had his residence first at the Brule Palace in Warsaw at the Saxon Square, which is today's Pilsudski Square. The palace was completely demolished by the Nazis, but is being rebuilt today. A couple of years after his first concert in Warsaw, this palace was where Frederic was invited to play for the Grand Duke. Konstantin was a brutal, sadistic man who enjoyed drilling his soldiers, not seldom ending in their death. But the Duke took a liking to young Chopin. Konstantin's wife, the Polish-born Joanna Gruczynska, was convinced that the boy and his playing had a calming effect on her husband's violent temper. That meant that Chopin was often called upon by Joanna to play for the Duke, from 1822 and onwards in Konstantin's new residence, the Belvedere, which still stands today. In 1823, Frederic passed the exam to enter the Warsaw Lyceum, and he was now on track to get an elite education. He was in a school of the best and brightest and was taught history, math, Latin, and drawing.
This Warsaw education served him for his whole life as a source of knowledge, as a source of culture.
Frederic was an astute observer, and he was talented in drawing. One of his sketches was of the rector of the Lyceum, Samuel Linde. When the rector heard about the drawing, he confiscated it. However, it must have been both good work and innocent, since Linde gave it back with the comment, "Well done." Another drawing by young Chopin of the same man exists, this one being made by a 15-year-old Fredéric. In the summer of 1824, Chopin traveled to the village of Zafarnia, living on the estate of the family of classmate Dominik Jewanowski. Frederic and Dominik spent a playful, happy summer in the Polish countryside with horse riding, parties, and family evenings with Frederic at the piano. Chopin created his own little newspaper, which he called Zafarnia Courier, which bears witness to the intelligence and humor of the boy. The newspaper stories often involved a certain Mr. Pichon, an anagram of Chopin. Home News, issue of August 27, 1824. The Honorable Mr. Pichon has encountered all kinds of unpleasantness from mosquitoes. They are biting him all over, but fortunately not on the nose, or it would become even longer than it already is. At Zafarnia, which he visited again the next summer, he experienced the harvest of the farmers. He went to play at a Jewish wedding, where he came in contact with Jewish folk music. It was probably also where he came most directly in contact with Polish folk music, music that would in spirit, rhythm, harmony, and form be present in his own music.
Chopin's contact with Polish folk music was a very important factor for some kind of his compositions, like mazurkas. The question is how he was approaching to this real folk music. He was certainly open to it. He never quoted folk music he heard in his music. He just transformed some structural models which were rhythmic structures of Polish folk music, and melodic structures or harmonic structures, being inspired by original folk music. And this is a very modern approach. Because there were people who quoted, folk tunes and prepared pieces, composed pieces based on it. No, in Chopin there are no quotations. There is a fantastic transformation of the folk sources to his own imagination, to his own view, and keeping them still folk. But the structure, what is inside, is his own imagination.
In 1825, Tsar Alexander visited Warsaw to open the Polish Parliament. As it happened, a concert for the Tsar was arranged in the rotunda of the Evangelical Church, and the foremost pianist of Warsaw, Fryderyk Chopin, performed for the Tsar. It seems like the Chopins were often rubbing shoulders with the Russian overlords, and the question arises if this might have been a moral dilemma for Mikołaj.
It's hard to answer this question. Maybe Chopin's father was considering these invitations as a kind of diplomacy, or he could fear in case he refuses. As a rational man, he and his family would like to stay in peace, I think.
When the 15-year-old Frederic returned from Zafarnia in 1825, he was elected to play the organ at Sunday Mass in the Church of the Nuns of the Visitation. The boy was excited and wrote humorously. Oh my lord, what a high-ranking individual I have become, only second to the priest in importance. It is interesting to speculate what this might have meant for his musical education, presumably playing Bach on the organ and using a different technique than is on the piano, often having to overlap fingers to create a melodic line, something he would later use in his piano music. It is easy to understand the boy's excitement. Today, a church organ might have the aura of old times, but in 1825, the technology of a church organ was considered as one of the most advanced of the day. During his time in Warsaw, Chopin created friendships, some of them lasting long into adulthood.
I think that what influenced his development was the spirit of friendship. Close friends were very important for him. It started with Jan Białobłocki, who was older, but somehow they understood each other and they exchanged things in the letters. Unfortunately, Białobłocki died during Chopin Warsaw time. During Warsaw time, the best friend of Chopin was definitely Tytus Wojciechowski, to whom Chopin sent various kind of news. He was writing about what was going on in Warsaw musical life. He was writing what was going with his own compositions, which is very rare in Chopin correspondence when he talks about his works. The most important fact Chopin discussed somehow with Wojciechowski was his first love, Konstancja Gładkowska. It was to Titus, or Titus, Chopin communicates his first love. As far as other friends are concerned, we have Jan Matuszyński, very well educated, oriented towards medicine. Other friend is Fontana, Julian Fontana. This is a special friendship because it was Fontana who was arranging Chopin's editions. Chopin was sending manuscripts to Fontana. Fontana was preparing versions for the publisher. Apart from rewriting Chopin's scores, which were very difficult to read, there are many crossings out, so Fontana did a wonderful work. Apart from that, Chopin asked Fontana to find his flat. When he decided to stay with George Sand, he needed a flat. So, starting several letters in which Chopin is describing all the details of his imagined flat. And Fontana could say, no, leave me alone. Why do you ask for such details? This was hard work for him, and it seems that after 10 or 12 years he had enough and he left Paris finally. The last on our list of closest Chopin friends is Wojciech Grzymała, and this is very special friendship. It's something like Chopin's relation to his sister Ludwika. If Chopin had existential thoughts, doubts, he wrote about them only to Grzymała, and that makes this friendship very special. So I think that Białobłocki, Wojciechowski, Matuszyński, Fontana and Grzymała were the best Chopin friends, and everyone in a different way. But all these makes a very distinct image of the life of an artist like Chopin.
By most measures, Chopin had a happy childhood, with no abusive parents, financial stability, good friends, and for the most time, he was in decent health. When his sister Emilia died, as well as his good friend Jan Białowiecki, both presumably from tuberculosis, a shadow, his fragile health, somewhat started to descend over Chopin's life. But nevertheless, the Wunderkind of Warsaw was now ready to become a young man, a piano virtuoso, and an up-and-coming composer who would be talked about way beyond Warsaw.